Screams in the Cemetery, a spine-tingling experience. The Great Depression started in 1929 after the stock market crashed and the economy collapsed. The hardships of this time changed the lives of every man, woman, and child in America and the world, and uniquely impacted on the lives of those living on a farm, like Pete, Libby, and their infant son, Rudy. After Pete lost his job as a ranch foreman in Michigan, he and his family became homeless. They quickly packed their 1926 Model T Ford with their most vital possessions and joined caravans along the highways. Some people walked while others rode in cars packed with family members. Men were desperate to find work, any job they could find so they could feed their hungry families. Libby virtually lived in the car while Pete searched for work. The minute they offered him a job as a gravedigger, he was ecstatic. He knew the work would be strenuous and back-breaking, but he was happy to have a job so he could support his family. Once the cemetery caretaker learned that Pete had a small child, he offered them rent-free shelter in an old farmhouse that sat next to the cemetery. Pete and Libby were grateful that they finally had a roof over their heads. They went to see the farmhouse and were surprised, to say the least. It turned out to be an old, run-down shack with rotten floors, broken windows, and large cracks between the wallboards. The shanty had apparently been abandoned for quite some time. "We'll fix it up slowly," Pete told Libby. The days passed, and Libby constantly remarked that she did not feel comfortable living next to the cemetery. In the daytime, the shanty appeared dismal and dull, but once nightfall came, it turned creepy and frightening. Libby was a superstitious woman who believed in ghosts and the afterlife. Each time she looked out at the cemetery, she thought she saw dark shadows moving about. Pete always told her that she was imagining things. Every morning before dawn, Pete left the house and headed to the cemetery to dig graves according to instructions from the caretaker. Sometimes he arrived home after dark, exhausted and ready for bed. Pete and Libby had been living in the shack 1 week when they walked to the nearest store for groceries. The clerk greeted them with a pleasant smile and a strong German accent. He apparently knew that they had recently moved into the old abandoned shack. "That's one scary house you're living in," he said to them. While he filled their order, he continued to chat. "The shack was occupied by a wealthy landowner back in the 1850s. He owned a large number of slaves that were tortured and kept chained inside the shack. They were all killed before slavery was abolished. Some folks say they've seen their ghosts strolling through the cemetery late at night," he continued. "Some even hear their dreadful cries in the middle of the night." Pete turned to look at Libby and saw her frightened face. "Don't believe anything he said," he told her on the way home. "These are just tales passed on from one generation to another." That night, while they were sound asleep, a dreadful sound jerked them out of bed. It sounded like heavy chains dragging across the floor. "It must be the ghosts of the slaves walking across the room," said Libby. "That's nonsense," said Pete. "We probably have animals sleeping under the floor of the shack." The loud scraping sound started at the front door and continued towards the kitchen. Accompanying the chains were grunts that sounded like a man struggling to breathe. The next morning, Pete crawled under the floor of the shack and found animal excrements. He showed them to Libby, and she breathed a sigh of relief. 5 days passed, and Pete had a lot of work to do. There were plots to dig and wooden coffins to build. One night, he arrived home and found Libby shaking like a leaf. "What's the matter, dear?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her. "I heard the ghosts of the slaves in the cemetery," she said, with a trembling voice. "Why do you say that?" he asked. "I heard their cries and screams, and they really frightened me." "It's probably children playing in the cemetery," he said, trying to calm her nerves. 1 week later, Pete and Libby had barely fallen asleep when a spine-tingling scream jolted them awake. "Help me, please! Help me!" A man's hoarse voice cried out in desperation. The frightening sound appeared to come from the cemetery. A crazed laughter followed, and there was complete silence. Pete ran outside and looked around, but he saw nothing. That night, Pete had trouble falling asleep. Although he did not believe in ghosts, he could not stop thinking about the store clerk's comments. 3 days later, the cemetery caretaker asked Pete to disinter the coffin of a recently buried man and bury it closer to the east fence. He wanted to make room for a family of 3 to be buried in the same area. Pete arrived home that night with frazzled nerves and a horror story to tell. "You look pale, Pete. What's wrong?" Libby asked. Pete then proceeded to tell her about his horrendous experience. "Today I dug a plot to move the coffin of a man from one location to another," he said, his voice quivering. "When I finally reached the coffin, I noticed a large crack across the lid. As I pulled the coffin up with a rope, the lid fell to the ground, exposing the cadaver." "What did you see, Pete?" Libby asked. "It's something I will never forget," he stammered. The hairs on the back of his neck stood straight up as he related the spine-chilling experience. "The walls of the coffin were covered with white silk, and there were gashes and rips where the man fought with all his might to open the lid. Dry blood was splattered all over the walls of the coffin, and his shoes were badly scuffed from trying to kick the lid open." "The man was buried alive?" Libby asked. "Yes," said Pete, clenching his jaw. "How can you be sure he was buried alive?" she asked. "Because he was face down in the coffin," he said, "and he had the most horrific expression on his face." Libby's jaw dropped with shock. Her eyes grew in size. Pete continued. "His fingers were chewed, and it looked like he had pulled a large mass of hair from his head." "How can this be happening?" said Libby. "I don't know," said Pete, "but I'm convinced that this is the same man whose voice we heard the other night. The poor soul must have had a gruesome death." Without delay, Pete looked for a job, and when he found it, they moved away. Pete and his family settled in a small town where he found work as a carpenter. 1 year later, Pete and Libby attended the funeral of a young teen who had a mysterious death. Suddenly, the boy sat up in his coffin, shocking family members and friends alike as they prayed around him. The parents learned that the boy suffered from a rare disorder that had placed him in a catatonic state. The condition is known today as catalepsy. Pete finally had an explanation for the horrible event he experienced as a gravedigger. Catalepsy is usually triggered by certain nerve disorders such as epilepsy, schizophrenia, or severe emotional shock. It lasts anywhere from a few minutes to days, sometimes even longer. Victims afflicted with the illness usually develop rigid muscles, an undetectable heartbeat, and diminished breathing. Some can still hear and sense everything around them, but they are unable to move. During the Great Depression, there was an increase in deaths due to severe hardships and stress. The fact that the embalmment process was not yet universally practiced may have contributed to people being buried alive. Those victims who woke up before their burials were lucky, but others did not have the same fate. Doctors unfamiliar with the disease declared people dead, while they were in fact alive. Imagine the unfortunate victims suddenly waking up and finding themselves inside a coffin and 6 feet below ground. In desperation, they must have kicked and pounded on their nailed coffin lids until they became exhausted and eventually died of oxygen deprivation. People living near the cemetery reported hearing cries for help coming from the cemetery, but simply chose to ignore them. Old superstitions and beliefs in the afterlife led them to believe that it was the ghosts and souls of the poor, wretched individuals who had not yet found peace in the afterlife. Could this story be true? The author's grandfather, the gravedigger who lived the experience, swore that the story was true until he died in 1954. The unnerving experience tormented him for many years. It caused him to have nightmares at night. He often wondered how many more people he had buried alive.